Okay, so welcome everybody to this guest lecture from our visiting scholar here from Salle University in Philadelphia, Charles Chip Gallagher. You all know I'm Mark Dietz. I'll just say this for the camera. Director at the Prince Al Center for American Studies and Research, which was a center founded in 2003 by Prince Al the Saudi royal family to build cross-cultural understanding between the United States and the Middle East following the terrorist attacks of 9/11 2001. And we're a part of an intellectual network consisting of universities here, American Study Centers here in the Middle East, here at AUC and also at AUB in Beirut, and then Islamic Study Centers at Cambridge and Edinburgh in the UK, and also at Georgetown and Harvard in America. And since then, we've also added NYU Abu Dhabi to this network. So anyway, we're grateful for that support in establishing the center, and we're delighted to welcome Professor Gallagher here to AUC, and to Cairo, and to Egypt. Dr. Gallagher is a professor in the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department and a senior fellow at Yale University's Urban Ethnography Project. This is at Salle University. His research focuses on social inequality, race relations, and immigration, and he has published over 50 articles, reviews, and books on these topics. As a Fulbright research scholar at the University of Birmingham in 2016 and 2017, Gallagher researched attitudes on immigration and Brexit. He has given more than 60 talks on these topics around the country, now around the world. He serves as an expert witness on civil rights cases dealing with allegations of institutional racism, and he is a frequent media source on these issues. His PhD and master's degree come from Temple University in Philadelphia, and he has a BS in economics from Drexel University. So he is born and bred in Philly, schooled in Philly, but that means Philadelphia, for those of you on the camera who don't know. And yeah, in fact, it even goes back further than that, but I'll let him tell you about that. So anyway, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Charles Chip Gallagher to AUC.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the forever is that I'm actually fourth generation Philadelphia. So yeah, I want to thank all the people I'm talking to. Thank you, Mark. It seemed to be great. The dean sponsoring me. Your center's great. So I just wanted to kind of give a shout out that this is my first time in Egypt, first time in Africa. So I travel a lot, but I've never done this conference, so it's kind of very exciting for me. And yeah, so today what I'm going to do, I'm going to move quickly because I was told this is fucking truncated because people have class at 2 o'clock. So I'm going to move quickly through it. Also, last night, they were doing translation, and the translators came up to me after they heard me speaking for them and said, "Would you please slow down?" So it's not my nature, so today I don't have to. So I can cover a lot of ground. But so I wanted to start my talk. Just basically, I'm going to tell a story. And the story is simply immigration in American history and how people in the United States see ourselves and how people around the world see the United States. We've all heard the expression, we're a nation of immigrants. And it is true by any measure. And I'm going to go through some of the measures tonight. But it's what we like to call ourselves, it's how we think about ourselves. And I like to think in some ways that the connotation is that we're welcoming. When immigrants come to the United States, they're welcoming. Of course, this is a room of academics, so you know that simply isn't true. Every group that has ever come, aside from the basic group considered the founding fathers, people coming from England or Scotland, every group has met some form of hostility and eventually pushback that resulted in typically government action. And I'm going to go through that really with the 20th century racial and ethnic politics of immigration. So, as I said, we are a nation of immigrants, so much so that John Kennedy wrote a book about it. Using the phrase that kind of defines our nation. Of course, we have New Yorkers in here, right? What do we know about the Statue of Liberty? They think between 50 and 70 million people went by that on their way to El Salvador. And it's really liberty, right? Fleeing economic crisis or religious persecution. This is the promise of the United States of America. And of course, on the base of it, what do we have? We have this line that everyone knows. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. This is the line we'd like to tell ourselves. Of course, we know that history says something that's quite different about urban populations and their treatment by the native group, by Americans, and also the response of moral panics in terms of what the government does in terms of legislation. And so that's kind of what I'm going to touch on today. This was kind of more directed at my undergraduates, but I think it's good here for everyone to think about this, right? And I really want you to think about this. Does anybody, and you're an undergraduate here, right? Would you be able to answer that question? Right? Would you be, so what % of people in the United States are foreign born who are not born in the United States? What would your guess be?
My guess would be like
30%. Okay, that's a good guess. Anybody else want to venture a guess? Sir, do you know what you want to venture a guess?
40%.
40%. Yeah, that's even better. And they're both very wrong. Okay, just so you know, right? But it's interesting. If you ask the average American in the street, do polling data, and you say, what do you think? They'll say about a third. So 1 out of every 3 people. The reality is that it's 15%. And this is the last year, so it's pretty recent numbers, right? So the reality is that it's a small percentage of the population, but it's an overwhelming amount of psychological energy that it takes up in our political discourse. And I have this up because the important part here is this is starting in 1850, we're going to 21. The sheer number of people has increased dramatically. We're going to talk about these increases and why they happen. But the larger point here is this slide, and this is the percent of the population. So really, the only time that the percent was close to 15% was basically here. The larger point is that it's, for the most part, been pretty flat. It's been around the same thing. The dip down is a result of basically legislation, which I'll talk about. But the idea that there is an invasion, a takeover, isn't borne out by the data at all. And we're going to talk about this number here, right? This is this giant swell. Of course, what this reflects, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is the change in the immigration law in 1965, which fundamentally opens the borders up for borders that have been closed since 1924. And this is what I want to talk about today, and I can do this quickly, but we talk about different waves in demography. The first wave here, basically North and Western Europeans, and then of course the big wave starts here, and this is where the problem starts, right? The problem starts with, quite honestly, my people, right? I'm Irish on one side, I'm Italian on the other side. Both of these groups were vilified by the dominant group, right? Throw in even worse groups, Russian Jews. All of a sudden, you have a population of people that basically become public enemy number one in the collective American consciousness, right? So what I want to talk about today is basically this group here, and what I'm really interested in basically is this dip. And anytime that there's a dip in immigrant flows, it means that there are social forces that cause it. And what they typically are, there are some combination of, maybe there was an economic crisis, there might have been a depression, a recession, and what that does is the notion basically panics, an economic panic, an idea that people are taking their jobs. But what this fundamentally suggests, right, these dips here, is some combination of racism, of xenophobia, of nativism, which cause a push for people to have their law puts pressure on politicians to write policies that basically restrict immigration. Of course, the most important and prominent one, which I'll get to, is the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924. So what we see here basically is waves coming. So the current immigration message that basically dominates our discussions basically are around these issues. And this might look familiar to some people here. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending the best. They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. Some, I assume, are good people. Now, you might have heard some of these quotes already. And Mexico will pay for the wall, 100%. They don't know it yet, but they're gonna pay for it. On day one, we will begin working on an impenetrable, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful southern border wall. And another politician, few of the children in the country learn English. The signs in our streets have inscriptions in both languages. Unless the stream of their importation could be turned, they will soon so outnumber us that we will not preserve our language, or even our government will become precarious. And finally, this is speaking in third person, of course, as he often does. Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what is going on. You might think these quotes were all from President Trump, and that would be, I think, a very, very good guess, given the language. But in fact, that's wrong. And I had this up just so you understand that this concern about immigration, about changing the cultural dynamics, the cultural DNA of our country, has been a battle for 300 years. Because this quote number 3, was from Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, of course, inventor, tinker, diplomat, statesman. Ben Franklin was very worried about German immigrants in the United States of America, refusing to assimilate, and that they would eventually take over our government. And Mark and I both have connections to Philadelphia, where Salle University is. There's actually a neighborhood in Philadelphia, and the name of the neighborhood is German. The Germans were in Pennsylvania, a very large ethnic group. And the concerns were real that Germans would take over. Now, of course, they did not take over. But the larger point is that what's happening in 1753, this concern, this paranoia, has been basically in place and operating for the last 200, 300 years. So these are recurring immigrant concerns, right? And this is I'm using 1924 specifically because that's the year that the Johnson-Reed Act was put in place by President Coolidge. And I want to talk about 2025, and this is Donald Trump. But these are the concerns, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about Ben Franklin or you're talking about Coolidge or Trump. These are the same concerns that constantly come up whenever there's a new wave of immigrants. 1, immigrants are taking over. 2, immigrants are prone to crime in the general population. Immigrants take job away from the native population. And finally, immigrants refuse to assimilate. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to just try to remember these, because I'm going to revisit this exact slide at the end, right, to tell you about what is fact and what is fiction. What I'm going to do, just to give you a sense of what the political climate was like 150 years ago, I'm using very, very famous political cartoons. So this would be Mask, Judge. They're very famous cartoons at the time. Why they're very effective as a primary source of information. Realize in this time in American history, many people were illiterate. They couldn't read, but they could look at a picture. And when they say pictures worth 1,000 words, it's true. These cartoons are so well done that they have 10, 8, 15 concerns all in one very, very well done political cartoon that is disseminated. This is the mass media. Right? There's no TikTok, there's no Facebook. It is a broadleaf newspaper. So I'm going to go through these cartoons. Each of them deserves an hour, but they don't have that. This is one very famous cartoon here. And there's some things that you need to know about. This is basically during the 1880s, 1890s, when anti-Chinese sentiment was at its peak. And the short story of it is, right, we of course had a desperate need for labor in the United States of America. Industrialization is happening, we're expanding, there's manifest destiny. We're building mountains, we're linking the Atlantic and the Pacific. And then the railroads were built, for the most part, on the Atlantic side by Irish immigrants, and on the West Coast side by Chinese immigrants. And so we were recruiting Chinese workers for the gold rush, for building basically our railroads, canals actually in New York and Philadelphia. But what happens is that basically the railroads are built, and then the Chinese workers migrated to cities. They're going to Seattle, they're going to San Francisco, and now they're competing for the wages. Right? Now, again, there was no real stiff competition against white workers for these jobs, because historically immigrants have always done the jobs that Native Americans don't want to do. and don't have to do it because they have better economic opportunities. So there is no stealing of jobs. It's in the United States, especially right now. White and Black Americans, they're not picking up avocados in California. It doesn't have to happen. So it's the same kind of nonsense here, right? But what's important here is that these are white women that used to basically watch the children. They were nurses, they were maids, they were servants. All these jobs now are being taken over. This was the concern. All these jobs are being taken over. And this is the quote here, right? How our streets will look next summer after the Chinese invasion. And it's very important that this word invasion is going to come up over and over again. And what's also interesting here is that if you study stereotypes, I do a lot of work on stereotypes, and the phenotypes attached to those stereotypes. Jews look a certain way, Italians look a certain way. These women are Irish, and Irish always have their nose upturned. Also, Irish men will always they'll look skinny, they'll look like an orangutan, which also is how African Americans are depicted. It's kind of a different story, but there's an overlap between the way that African Americans and the Irish are depicted in these cartoons. A lot of similarities. Irish men will also typically have a pipe they smoke, and will typically have a bottle of whiskey. Right? Again, these stereotypes of the Irish. But again, what these do is they convey an enormous set of stereotypes and concern and anxiety all in one cartoon. So other cartoons that are very famous, you might have seen this cartoon before. It's very, very famous. This is during basically we do not yet have the Chinese Exclusion Act. But right here is China, and the wall of China has come down, and the Chinese are coming over. They're invading the United States of America. And the whole storyline here is that in many cases in American history, the new old unifies to keep out the newest thing. And this is what's depicted here, right? So who do we have here? And I love these images here, right? Here's the Irish guy. He's got his pipe. He's got his hat. He has his nose, right, kind of orangutan. African American. This is the Civil War. You can tell from the cap. This is an Italian. I had to look this up. I didn't realize this is a hat that was typical of French. And then we have basically an Italian. All these immigrants, relatively new immigrants, coming together to keep out the newest immigrant. And what are they doing? They're building a wall to keep them out. Again, invasion and wall. We see these kinds of images all the time. Up here's the wall. And so what do we have here? Throwing down the ladder by which they rose. And here again, immigrants, he's Irish, he has a bottle. They're building a wall. They're pushing down the ladder that basically would allow Chinese immigrants into the country. And it's kind of hard to see here, but the flag says the Know Nothing Party. And I know a lot of you here would know about it, but the party came into existence simply for one thing, to keep new immigrants out of the country. So this is another very, very famous cartoon. We have here, this is Uncle Sam, as we know what represents the United States of America. And then again, the great fear of the period, Uncle Sam to be swallowed by foreigners. Uncle Sam, literally, Uncle Sam, our culture, our way of life is being devoured by new immigrants. They're taking over our culture, they're taking over our land, they're taking over our jobs, they're taking over our women. Right? So what do we have here? We have someone that's Irish. We have someone here with a ponytail that's Chinese, and they're literally devouring Uncle Sam. Now, it's important to note here, these are rail lines. The United States, right? We were building railroads everywhere. Remember who built the railroads? Irish and Chinese. So it has as a backdrop. And then we have them coming together. And of course, the problem is solved. Chinese basically are going to outnumber the Irish and take over. And so this is the concern about Chinese Americans in the 1870s and 1880s. So what's the response? This is the idea. There becomes a moral panic. People are worried. People are concerned. They put pressure on politicians to write legislation. They pass an act of law. The president signs it. The Supreme Court says that it's constitutional, and it becomes law. And so we have the Chinese Exclusion Act that bars Asians from entering the United States until 1965. It's 83 years, right? And if you were Chinese or Chinese American, you were not a citizen. You could not be a naturalized citizen. Right? Now, there's one little quirk with this. In 1941, because the Chinese aligned themselves with the United States during World War II, if you were born in the United States, you were granted citizenship. But it was a little quirk of history that it only had to do with the war. So again, this is Uncle Sam kicking at the Chinese. And this is what again, you really think about this for a moment. In 1880, Chinese immigrants made up 0.02% of the US population. Okay? Not 2%, 0.2%. Would you call this an invasion? I mean, the number is minuscule, but of course they're very visible. They're easily recognized as the other. So again, quite honestly, I mean, this is a thank you, Mark. I didn't know this number until I was prepping for this lecture. How small the Chinese population was in the United States of America. Okay, now moving forward, the next kind of wave of groups here. This is big wave, basically, Southern and Eastern Europe. This is my grandfather, who was an immigrant from Sicily, right? He came during that time. We have a large population coming. They're not coming from Western Europe. They're coming from Eastern Europe. They're coming from Southern Europe. They have a number of marks against them. They're not really white. They're kind of this liminal category where they're not black, but they're not really like English. They're kind of this marginal, right? And there's many good books about how the Irish became white, how Italians became white, how Jews became. That's the name of these books, quite honestly. How each group basically had this marginal racial status and entered the kind of racial mainstream. The word, of course, is assimilation. But these groups have two big things they have, three things. One, I don't use this word lightly, but a word that was used like they were swarthy, right? My grandfather was swarthy, it was brown skin, olive skin. So they had that going against them, one, and they were either horrible two things, they were either Catholic or Jewish, right? In a country that is basically run by Protestants, right? We are a Protestant country, like we are a WAS country, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants founded our nation. So what do we have here? This is again very, very Thomas Nast. This is a brilliant, brilliant cartoon. I don't want to spend 25 minutes on it, but I can because it's very, very layered. The larger point basically here is basically Italians are coming into New York City. This is New York City. This is the Tammany Hall crowd up here. Italians are coming into New York City. The Irish are in New York City, and the Catholic. But the schools are run by Protestants. So if you went to a public school in New York City in 1900 and 1890, you would be instructed by a teacher. That teacher would also give you religious instruction. That's a Bible. So you got religious instruction in public schools. Separation of church and state doesn't happen until later. So this becomes a fight now because the Catholics say we don't want our children learning your Protestant Bible or what you're teaching. So it becomes a war of sorts about who's going to control the public schools. And what's depicted here, these are bishops. The mitre that bishops wear, if you're Catholic, right? But if you look closely, there's the face, they're Irish. There's the pushed up nose. They are brilliantly, these are Irish priests that represent crocodiles that are literally going to eat Protestant children. Again, devouring. And what do we have here? We have Wall Street dropping Protestant children to be eaten by the Catholics. And here we have, of course, Lady Liberty being brought to the gallows. This is basically the capital. It's now the Vatican, right? And then part of this narrative is what was called paganism at the time, right? There was this idea that for Jews, basically, and for Catholics, they can never be real Americans. If you're Catholic, you can never be a real American because push comes to shove, your real allegiance is in Rome, to the Holy See and the Vatican. And if we're ever in a war in Europe, you're not going to align yourself with the Constitution, American flag. Your allegiance is with the Pope. And the same thing with Jews and Zionists. So this is when you can never be truly an American because of your religion. And again, what I'm really getting is anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism. Really. So this is just a great cartoon. It's just right again here, the upside down flag. And again, remember, the American River Ganges, right? And this is, I had to read about what was he getting at? Right, the River Ganges, right? It's basically almost Orientalism and Said, the idea that the mysticism of the East, right? That Catholics have a religion that Protestants brought was a form of mysticism. The whole rituals of Catholicism is very foreign to what Protestants thought about Catholics. So here we have one. This is another brilliant cartoon. This is, of course, gaining entry to the United States of America. Walk in. This person represents quintessentially a Jew from the pale. Right, someone that, again, two ways of Jews. The first wave of Jews were educated and were more secular. The second wave of Jews are basically from shelter. They're poor, they're farmers, and they're coming. And so this person represents everything basically that it's superstition, it's poverty. And the caption here is the Jewish immigrant says, "Can I come in?" Uncle Sam says, "I suppose so. There's no law to keep you out." Of course, we know what's coming. There is going to be a law, right? And the only way to keep people out is to create some kind of fund. We need to basically close the gates. It's only 2% they closed it. The only way to handle it is close. And so what happens next, of course, is the Johnson-Reed Act. And the Johnson-Reed Act was the most restrictive piece of immigrant legislation ever passed in American history until then. Depending what happens with what Trump actually does, this basic piece of legislation, and here's Woodrow, I'm not going to see this is cool, signing it. Again, so you understand the language of the day, Coolidge signs the GAPP bill. Of course, for my American colleagues, we know that GAPP is a jargon, a word, it's a racist word, but again, this is, a mainstream newspaper. The Johnson-Reed Act excluded immigrants until the border reopened in 1965. And that's the Taft-Seller Act, right? Another invasion that people don't know about that much, I'll go through this quickly. We had for many, many decades in the South and Southwest of the United States, what's called the Bracero program. And it allowed a very informal labor movement of Mexicans to come to the United States, basically tend to the crops, do the needs for the plantocracy, and then go back to Mexico. And it was never policed, it was understood, there was an agreement. They were unbelievably needed during World War II because the people that worked the fields were white owners of the land, many were at war. So the war effort basically created the need to have Mexican workers pick the crops that fed America. So they were very, very much needed. War's over, people come back. What also happens is mechanization. Mechanization of farms. And we just don't need the volume of Mexicans. And this is the panic is addressed. Once again, we have two things going on. To wipe up a kind of public hysteria. One, Mexicans are aligned with or are led to believe that they're affiliated with communism. And we're now in the Cold War, so this becomes a red scare. It also becomes an economic worry. And the economic worry is that every 2 minutes they're coming across the border, right, to get the border. And so what happens? Well, again, the response is the largest deportation in American history. It was called Operation Wetback. Eisenhower's on record using the word Operation Wetback. I should say Donald Trump pointed to this policy as the template for what he wanted to do. He said, I'm going to do what Eisenhower did, and I'm going to do it bigger. Of course, it's always big with Trump. It's going to be bigger. So Operation Wetback, what does it do? It's a deportation program. In 1 year, in 54, this is what happens. 1 million Mexican Americans are pushed out. So again, people don't talk about this much, it happened quickly, but again, I should have brought this, another slide about Donald Trump's comments about this policy worked. So moving forward, 9/11, the war on terror, he was involved with Afghanistan, I should say it's in Iraq as well, and the rise of American Islamophobia. Right? And this is an ongoing problem in the United States of America. No more Muslims, right? Again, this is from Pew. The average American believes that a quarter of our population is Muslim. A quarter. Anybody know what it is actually in the United States? Anybody want to give a guess? Any of our students? I picked on you already. Right? How about the two folks in the front? Anybody? Do you have any idea how many Muslims live in the United States of America? If you don't know, it's okay, just give a crazy guess. What was that? 25%. So if you think like that's what most Americans think, that's right. But that too is wrong, okay? This is again perceptions. Here's the thing, perception becomes reality. And if your reality is off, you have off in ways that makes it problematic, right? The real number is 1.3% of the United States is Muslim. Muslims are not taking over the United States. And to say that is it's just not wrong. It has an agenda. This is propaganda. Again, this is important to understand because it would be, to me, it wouldn't seem very logical to enact federal policy to write laws of Congress that the president signs that the Supreme Court says is constitutional when this number is what you're talking about. So, but of course, that is the problem, right? Say no to Syrian terrorists, refugees, stop Islam, On March 6th, Donald Trump said, I think Islam hates us. Imagine the arrogance of saying a world religion that has almost 2 billion adherents collectively thinks it's way. Trump said, we're having problems with these Muslims and we're having problems with Muslims coming to our country. So again, what's the response? Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. Trump banned 7 predominant Muslim countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, and stopped Syrian refugees from coming. These are the countries affected. And again, someone pointed out that countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, were left off the list because Donald Trump has business dealings. That's one of the answers made. I don't think that that's a stretch. Hate crimes, this is a problem. And this is one of the problems. The leader of the free world using his bully pulpit to denigrate populations. There is consequences. And the consequences are hate crimes. Hate crimes went up after Donald Trump put in the Muslim ban all over the country. So again, their words have consequences. So next group, Latino invasion. Again, invasion is the word we hear all the time. Here is basically Lady Liberty drowning basically in the waves and waves of people coming from Mexico and Central and South America. And again, amnesty, this is really under Barack Obama, was a very bad word for a lot of people. Amnesty was fundamentally about granting citizenship to people that had lived in the country for a very long time, but were not documented. Again, this is the United States of Mexico. These are political cartoons that appeared in national syndicated newspapers. Here's the American flag in the trash. Right, Mexico is taking it over. The Latino immigration is connected to crime. And again, it's back to the idea that immigrants are inherently criminal, right? And of course, it's connected with what's going on in Colombia. And what was Trump's first, right? This is when he was first elected president. What's his response? We talked about the wall. Mexico will pay for it. This is again, he would do this kind of shout out to us at the rallies. What do you want? And people would scream, a wall. And then Trump would say, who's going to pay for it? And people would scream, Mexico. It's like a back and forth. And of course, we know now, right? The fact of it is that Mexico hasn't paid a cent, not paid 1 cent. Look, Mexico has not paid for 1 cent of it. And in reality, this took me a while to find. There's only been 80 miles of new wall that's been constructed at the cost of billions and billions of dollars. USA Today, the national newspaper, they did a text analysis, and they wanted to look at certain words that Donald Trump used over and over and over in rallies. What were they? Predator, invasion, alien, killer, criminal, and animal. They looked at these words. 500 times Donald Trump used that language. This is denigrating immigrant populations. Now we're up to the more recent times. Trump's language on immigration running for president in 2023-24, right? They're not humans. They're not humans. They're animals. I use the word animal because that's what they are. They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. We're a dumping ground, like a garbage can for the world. That's happened. And of course, many scholars were very quick to point out that this was exactly the kind of language that Hitler used to describe and denigrate populations, right? So what's the response been? What is Donald Trump? It's not just a response, it's a promise. Donald Trump, I believe, much of how he got into office was promising things to the 78 million people that voted. I also want to be clear, 75 million people did not vote. Let's remember that. But he's now basically, he's paying back on what he said he would do. And what is he going to do, you think? I mean, it hasn't even been 100 days yet, but this is what is on the table right now. An end to birthright citizenship. Being born in the United States no longer makes you a American citizen. And it's kind of important to note out that this comes from the 14th Amendment. When enslaved Africans were free, if you were enslaved African, you had no rights. You weren't a citizen, you had no standing in court, you couldn't own land. What the 14th Amendment did is they enslaved Africans citizens. That's where it comes from. Now he's now challenging. So of course this will be a Supreme Court test, but this is what is on the table. He wants to deport 11 million people. and he wants to basically use the military to do it. Which, of course, you know, in American history, you never use the military for civilian actions. Right? You use the National Guard, not the military. Reinstating travel bans. So this is going back on the table on what he calls deficient countries. Who is a deficient country? We can imagine what it might be. I know what it's not. There's a great picture of the Statue of Liberty, and on the bottom it says, this is a Trump cartoon. It's the Statue of Liberty, on the bottom it says, "Send me your Norwegians." Right? Donald Trump wants white, rich immigrants coming to the United States. Eliminating DACA, we talked about this. Basically, if your parents came to the United States from the Dominican or Honduras, and you were 2 and your sister was 5, and you've been here for 20 years, and you're really thoroughly American, you've never been to Honduras. The idea is that what DACA did basically try to grant you citizenship. That's going to go away. And then finally, once the seal the border, what we're going to do is send out 5,000 Marines and Army soldiers. So this is the response. Now, these things are playing out right now, so I don't know where we're going with this. But these are the policies that Donald Trump is basically pushing. So I want to get back. Oh yeah, I just had this morning, just for a little fun for all of you if you've been paying attention to this, right? This was 2 weeks ago, was the Gulf of Mexico. Donald Trump is now calling it, and Google is going along with it because he has friends in Google and Facebook. It is now the Gulf of America. Right? We're taking back the Gulf. And then finally, I asked you to try to go on to the points I said at the very beginning, right? Immigrants are taking over, 15% is not a take. I mean, statistically, just doesn't make sense. Second, immigrants are more prone to crime, and very, very good social science research done on this. In fact, it's the opposite. Immigrants are more likely to engage in crime than the native-born population. And there's 2 other points that this sustain this. One, cities with large immigrant populations have lower crime rates. 1. 2, crime rates throughout the United States, and criminologists really don't know exactly why it's happening, but it's happening. Over the last decade, crime rates have gone down significantly everywhere. At the same time, that the immigrant population has increased. So this statement that immigrants is factually incorrect. Immigrants take jobs away from the native population. Every economist will tell you it's the other way around. That immigrants are a net plus to the economy. The unemployment rate in the United States is 4%. We need labor, right? We need, quite honestly, cheap labor. Immigrants take jobs that Americans are willing to do in agriculture, construction, hospitality. Immigrants contribute economically by filling labor shortages, create more jobs, and grow the economy. And then finally, immigrants will not assimilate. And again, there's very, very good studies looking at intergenerational assimilation rates. Grandma, mom, and dad, how do people basically assimilate? And the fact is that this group, and some of the people say faster, what I'm hearing is that immigrants are assimilating faster than my grandparents did. And a lot of that has to do with access to television and media. So sorry if I seem rushed. I'm trying to get this all in so we can have a conversation. Here we go. So thank you. You have a question?
Good. You told me the done before quarter till, so you made it.
Oh, I did. Look at that.
Yeah, impressive.
Wow. Academics can go on.
Yeah, I see you're from Kansas. You can't talk that fast. Or you'll take a lot longer.
Sure.
I was thinking when you were speaking about the percentage of the immigrants to the population, but you were speaking in, let's say, very general terms. When you say, let's say, 15% of the total population, as if the 15% are widespread all over the United States. Now, it's part of the problem. I'm just guessing. I need a bit that they are concentrated in certain areas, which makes it much easier for some politicians, whatever, like Donald, to pinpoint them and say, look at this neighborhood. It's full of immigrants, and they're portrayed as if that's all American. While in fact, they were dispersed it would have been less of an impact and people might have accepted them more easily.
Well, you're exactly right, that, we have residential segregation in the United States of America, and neighborhoods are black and they're brown, and they're concentrated. And new immigrants tend to be concentrated in urban areas. And news centers are in urban areas. So I lived in Atlanta for 11 years, and CNN is, and all CNN had to do was had to just drive 1 mile into a black neighborhood, drive half a mile into a Latino neighborhood. See, that's where the news sources are. So the combination of the concentration is there. It is not evenly dispersed throughout the country. That's absolutely true. And New York City is a classic example. A third of the population in New York City is foreign. Right? But New York, Miami, they're anomalies. You know, the idea is that there are certain cities that have large immigrant populations. Again, the larger point though is that they are 15% of the population. They're not taking over. Now, certain cities, certain neighborhoods, you can walk to New York and be in a neighborhood where it's Nigerians and the other neighborhood is all Puerto Ricans. That's absolutely true. But that is not to say that immigrants are taking over. That's the kind of things and that's where kind of ideology, propaganda, and I also think that in many ways that it's depictions in the media. Donald Trump is very fond of saying that, especially Latinos, they're very dangerous. They're all in MS-13. They're all in Gallagher. This is just not true. I mean, it's patently false to suggest that immigrants, like I said, are more criminal. They're not.
Or the Haitians eat cats.
Well, I just read an article about using that language, you know. So what did he do? It's so interesting what happens, and this is to both reports. Donald Trump says on stage, debating Kamala Harris, that what's happening in Springfield, Ohio is horrible. People are eating their neighbors' dogs and cats. Who are they? They're black Haitians who have been resettled. And they went to the city managers, the police chief, and said, there's no record of anyone losing their animals. This is fiction. But fast forward 4 days, when they asked people, especially Donald Trump supporters, 60% said they think that's probably true. And this is the way that media propaganda works. Because people are in these kind of bubbles. You know, you're in this echo chamber where everyone is saying the same disinformation you come to believe. And I think that that's the kind of worry about immigrant size and immigrant discrimination is exactly the same. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Please.
So it's really and I think in some of the advertisements and then also in your own scholarly work, you focus on colorblind constitutionalism. And so imagine that I agree with you that colorblind constitutionalism is a problem, but it's used as a sort of figure for ongoing racial discrimination, segregation, etc. I was wondering if you could connect that, if there is a connection to the developmental story that you've been telling here, and more specifically to the present moment. In other words, what looks like outright nativism and not like the sort of figure of colorblind constitutionalism seems to be the sort of logic of the present moment. But you're the expert, so I'd love to hear more about that connection or disconnect.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, colorblindness, colorblind constitutionalism, which of course I always find it's an oxymoron. Our Constitution has never been colorblind. But I think it's interesting what's happening now with diversity, equity, inclusion mandates. They're being strict. They're being, like today I read it wasn't Target, it was Paramount Pictures. I mean, every large corporation now is pulling out policies that were put in place historically to basically do wider searches to bring people in that have historically been marginalized. And so the idea is now we don't need that any longer because we are colorblind. This is what, and I think that ties to the Constitution, where it is a perversion of the Constitution to say that we can never take race or ethnicity or gender into the calculus about how we think about hiring or policing. I don't think I'm getting at what you're talking about. Are you talking about colorblindness as an ideology?
Yeah, so I mean, like as you know, like the sort of the language of colorblind constitutionalism emerges from the dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson.
Right.
I think that's the sort of focus.
Is that Harlan's dissent you're talking about?
Justice John Marshall Harlan's.
Yeah, so Harlan's dissent, I mean, yeah, after Harlan's dissent, his life was over too. I think that's funny, but Harlan's dissent, of course, stands out, but it's never been, I mean, we've never followed it.
Yeah,
So I think I'm missing what you're getting a little bit.
Yeah, so so what I'm seeing now in the United States and what you seem to have talked about is like outright discrimination and outright acceptance of discrimination. Whereas I think that the scholarly work of colorblind constitutionalism is that it presents an image of American republicanism that is never the case, never historically the case, and is used as a rhetorical figure for discriminatory policies. Whereas now it seems like we've pulled the fig leaf away and nobody's really talking about colorblind constitutionalism with any degree of authenticity. And instead they're just saying, outright nativism, outright discrimination is acceptable to us.
Right. Well, I think it's worse than that. I think it's a step beyond that, where the discrimination that's taking place now is against white males. And this is the Harvard cases, this is the Chapel Hill cases about my white kid or my Asian kid didn't get into school because of their skin color. And I think that this is kind of a complete perversion of first of all, from how affirmative action works, one. And two, that the idea we no longer need that because we are colorblind. And if you use race in any conceivable way, you're the one that's racist. So I think it's the step beyondwards where it's an inversion of the power structure to maintain the status quo. And the status quo is to keep basically white folks where they are. And that's kind of how I see it. I mean, I think it's more of an ideological way to basically reassert white privilege in a way where you're using the law to do it. Are we talking about the same thing? Or?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was just thinking about like this sort of Coolidge to Trump arc and what I was expecting during the presentation. And I was wondering if there's like a sort of disconnect, like, you know, in like Bush 2, you know, we would hear about colorblind constitutionalism, and now it just seems like you don't even need it anymore, you know, it's just like hardcore pure nativism. And I was curious from the point of view of American political development, if you also would agree that we've had this sort of disconnect, or, you know, if you know, really, you know, that there was a fig leaf, but nobody took it that seriously. You know, there was this sort of, you know, white parental, you know, approach under Bush 2, etc. And so really it's a continuation of the same.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you that we have always been, there's either an amnesia or a blind spot. Yeah. Did you have anything about that?
I did, yeah, actually. Yeah, I think, I think in a way, Chris, you're talking about systemic racism, systemic discrimination that's always been there. And Trump is, like you said, removed the fig leaf or kind of ripped off the Band-Aid, pulled the cover back. And now everybody can see that, but people appreciate that, right? Like his supporters do, because, and even some people who are not his supporters who say, well, at least he's not like trying to hide it, like, you know, he's just telling the truth. And so he receives a political reward for that.
Yeah, no, I agree.
At some point, like the rhetorical valorization of right discriminatory policy is a sort of becomes like a difference in kind. From one point of view, you know, I mean, from a more sociological point of view, maybe it isn't a difference in kind. Maybe it is just, you know, a war on, you know, outrace by different means. And maybe as a political theorist, you know, I'm looking at it and exaggerating the difference when you rip off the Band-Aid and say outright and gets, you know, rewarded as Mr. Trump for, you know, what really looks, what I think would have looked shocking under earlier administrations. So, and it does not somehow appear shocking.
Right. Yeah, he gets rewarded for being a truth teller.
Yeah, and also it's the punitive part to that is the whole conversation about critical race theory, which, you know, I asked my students have never heard of critical race theory. Now, I was studying critical race theory in graduate school because I was studying race. But the idea that very simply critical race theory looks at how race has been baked into our institutions. If it's Jim Crow or slavery, whatever, internment acts. If you're using critical race theory in a class, and really it's only in law school that you really hear that, you are now subject to basically having your class removed. You're not allowed to use critical race theory now in Texas, in Florida. So I think it's almost a erasure of anyone that wants to examine systemic racism. I think it's worse than you're even saying. So did you have anything about that in front? Yeah, please.
And I'm going to go back, like, I want to go back one step, because I've been always interested in all the So I think it's gonna ironic that Trump wants to, or actually implemented Muslim ban when one of the big claims is that, you know, they're trying to fight anti-Semitism. I think it has an extremely big religious aspect to it. So I don't know, like if Jews, for instance, this is like from a purely religious perspective on Muslims, if Jews came like tomorrow and said, okay, we want to take over the United States, what would the reaction be, especially considering that Trump himself is not a Jew?
So if you're saying Muslims said they want to take the United States?
No, but Jews. Because Muslims already like he wants to ban Muslims from like the US. So what if we think about it from like the Jewish equation, why they want, like why they claim that they're fighting anti-Semitism against Jews, right? When they actually want to ban Muslims, isn't it kind of difficult? No.
Well, to suggest that this administration is consistent with anything is kind of a stretch, but so let me just make I understand your question properly. Is that if Jews said they wanted to take over the country, what would happen? Yeah. So, you know, Donald Trump says the Jews want it, you know, and I should say also that there are a slice of American Jews that basically support Trump, and it was larger than I thought it would be. The overwhelming majority of Jews in the United States of America did not support Donald Trump, and specifically because of his position on Gaza. And Netanyahu basically is seen as extremely problematic. I don't even answer your question. It's a very good question. You know, Donald Trump says that he has Jews in his family and that he's worked with Jews all his life. I mean, so, you know, I don't know. Do you mean like as a geopolitical, like what the response would be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if this, I remember the statistics right, but like party-wise, does the Democratic Party have more Jews than the Republicans?
It does. But let's remember, Jews are in turn, Jews like Muslims Jews are less than 2% of the US population. So, you know, and Jews are overrepresented in certain industries because of historic reasons. There's a reason why Jews are overrepresented in media. You know, it's really a very interesting story. It was a wide open field. It wasn't monopolized by anyone yet, and they got in when it started. So you got the ground floor. So there are certain reasons. There's reasons why Jews are overrepresented in law, because everybody can have a shame. You get your JD, and you can set up your own shop. Because Jews in Philadelphia, if you were Jewish, you were not working at a corporate downtown white shoe law. It wasn't happening. It wasn't happening if you were black. It wasn't happening if you were Jewish. But Jews are just a tiny part of the population. So, you know, again, this is the kind of thing. How are we concerned about Muslims taking the United States of America when they're not only small, they're in like 3 or 4 cities? So I understand what you're saying, but I think that it's a good question, but it's the same kind of paranoid response that Trump has against Muslims, with being a tiny part of the population. And I should say that if you look at the history of folks that are Muslims and who are very different populations, Arab Americans, 2 different populations, but before 9/11, they were assimilating in unbelievably fast rate. They were seen basically as kind of in the margins of whiteness. If someone moved into your neighborhood that was a Muslim or was an Arab American, no one put a for sale sign. They weren't a problem group. They probably patronized until 9/11. And after that, they become racialized and they become demonized. And so racialization of a group, people thought about them differently, they defined them differently, and then you have the rise of Islamophobia. So I don't know if I gave you an adequate answer. Yes, so.
Well, there may conflict between the Americans and the German after Hitler when German American brought in the United States.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I always think about on the West Coast, right? We have Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 41, and within a very short time, we are rounding up Japanese Americans that had no connection, right, to here, Hitler, and the Empire of Japan, put in called internment. It's a prison camp. And I always think, well, why don't they do the same thing on the East Coast to German Americans and Italian Americans, right? We're fighting Germany, we're fighting Hitler, we're fighting Mussolini. And of course, can you imagine going to neighborhoods, to Brooklyn or Queens or Philadelphia, and trying to take white assimilated Italians to a camp? You know, so No, there were no, Germantown were so assimilated. You know, now, I should say that, the boom part, there was in fact for a short time, there was a rise of German Americans that were aligned with an early Hitler. And once they realized that this was really a problem, it's completely disintegrated. I imagine there were some Germans who aligned themselves with Nazi ideology, but they were a minuscule part of the US population. Yeah, and once we were fully in the war, that they would have been completely ostracized. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Anybody else, any questions or thoughts or comments, commentary? Anything I missed?
Well, it's 2:00, so, some of us, like me, have to get to
Yeah,
class.
so we have time.
To teach, so, thank you all for coming though, and, thank you to Chip Gallagher for, a very thought-provoking, presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.